Take a drive through just about any neighborhood in this country right now, and I guarantee you'll spot at least one. Whether you're in a quiet suburb, a small farming town, or anywhere in between. An RV sitting in a driveway. Tires looking a little low, a thin layer of pollen or dust built up on the roof. Maybe a for sale sign taped in the window that's been fading in the sun for months. The phone number on it barely legible anymore. It's not broken down. Nobody repossessed it. The owners aren't fighting some warranty battle with the manufacturer. It's just sitting there, unused, quietly becoming somebody's expensive regret. Taking up space where a car used to park. Collecting leaves in the gutters along its roofline every fall, while the family that bought it with such excitement drives right past it every single day without so much as a second glance anymore. I want to talk about that rig today, because I think it tells you something a whole lot of folks in this industry already know, but almost nobody wants to say out loud on camera. Everybody in this business, the dealers, the full-timers, the folks running RV forums and Facebook groups, they all know exactly why so many brand new rigs end up right back on the market within a year or two of that first purchase. It's really not truly about the money, though money troubles are real, and I've talked about that on this channel before. It's not really about defects and shoddy build quality either, though that's real too, and I've covered that as well. The real reason, the one everybody in this industry quietly nods along to, but rarely says plainly to a first-time buyer standing on the lot with stars in their eyes, is a whole lot simpler and a whole lot more honest than either of those. And honestly, a whole lot harder to put a dollar figure on or point a finger at. Most folks buy the fantasy of RVing without ever learning the actual skill of it. And when reality doesn't match the fantasy, they don't fix the gap. They just quit and sell, quietly, without ever telling anybody the real reason why. Because admitting you felt overwhelmed by something that was supposed to be relaxing feels a lot more embarrassing than admitting you had a mechanical problem or a money issue that wasn't really your fault to begin with. Let me explain what I mean by that, because I don't want this to sound like I'm blaming anybody for not knowing something they were never taught in the first place. When you watch an RV commercial, or scroll through a glossy brochure, or even just picture the whole idea in your head before you've ever actually done it, you're picturing the good part. Sunset views out the window, a cup of coffee on a fold-out chair somewhere beautiful, the freedom of pulling up wherever you want and calling it home for the night. Nobody's out there making a commercial about backing a 32-foot trailer into a tight site while 3 other campers watch and judge your driving. Nobody's filming the part where you're on your knees in the rain trying to figure out why your water pump won't prime, or the part where you spend an hour on the phone with a manufacturer's helpline trying to understand why your propane won't light. That part doesn't sell rigs, so it doesn't get talked about, and folks walk onto that lot with a picture in their head that's maybe 20% of the actual experience. Even the dealer walkthrough itself, the one moment where you'd think somebody would sit you down and really prepare you for what owning this thing actually involves, tends to work against you here. A typical walkthrough happens the same day you're picking up your rig, usually in a bit of a hurry because there's paperwork still to finish, and maybe another customer waiting behind you, and it's structured to hit the highlights, showing you where things are rather than teaching you how they actually work or what to do when they don't. You leave that walkthrough with a general sense of where your water heater switch is located, but not necessarily a real understanding of how that water heater actually functions, what a normal cycle sounds and feels like, or what the early warning signs of a problem might look like before it becomes a real issue. It's information delivered in exactly the wrong format for actually retaining it. A rushed verbal tour on the single most overwhelming and exciting day of the whole process, when your brain is genuinely half-occupied, just soaking in the fact that you finally own this thing you've been dreaming about. Let me get specific about what that skill gap actually looks like, because it's easy to talk about it in general terms without really painting the picture. Take something as basic as your electrical system. Most rigs run 2 completely different kinds of power: a 12-volt system that runs your lights and your water pump and your fans off the battery, and a 120-volt system that runs your outlets and your air conditioner off shore power or a generator. And those 2 systems behave completely differently. draw power completely differently, and troubleshoot completely differently. A brand new owner who's never had that explained to them can end up thinking their whole electrical system is broken, when really it's just that their battery's low and their 12-volt lights are dim, while their 120-volt outlets are working just fine, leading to a panicked call to a service center or an unnecessary trip cut short over something that a 5-minute explanation would have completely resolved. That's not a defect. That's not a financial problem. That's just nobody ever sitting them down and explaining how their own rig actually works. Or take your black tank, something almost nobody wants to talk about. But every single RV owner has to learn to manage. There's a right way to treat that system, using enough water, using the right kind of tank treatment, waiting to dump until it's sufficiently full so the water flow actually clears solids out properly. And there's a wrong way that leads to clogs, smells, and problems that feel disgusting and overwhelming to a first-time owner who's never had anybody walk them through the basics. I've heard from more than a few of you over the years who told me you nearly gave up on RVing entirely after one bad black tank experience early on. Not because the system itself was faulty, but because nobody had ever taught you the handful of simple habits that keep it working the way it's supposed to. Habits that take all of 5 minutes to learn but somehow never make it into the conversation. Until after somebody's already had a bad experience learning them the hard way. Weight and towing basics trip folks up too, especially those coming from a background with no experience hauling anything larger than a small utility trailer behind a pickup or an SUV. Understanding your tow vehicle's actual capacity, how weight distribution hitches work, how to check your tire pressure appropriately for the load you're carrying, none of that comes naturally, and none of it gets fully explained in a rush dealer walkthrough that's more focused on showing off the kitchen countertops than teaching you the mechanics of safely getting that rig down the highway. A new owner who feels shaky and unsure every single time they hook up to tow isn't going to relax and enjoy the trip the way somebody who's confident in that process will, and that constant undercurrent of nervousness wears people down faster than any single mechanical problem ever could. Here's the thing though. RVing has always had a real learning curve to it. It always has, going all the way back to the earliest days of folks converting vans and pulling little teardrop trailers behind their cars. The difference is, it used to be that folks learned this stuff from somebody. A dad who'd been doing it for years. A neighbor down the street who'd talk your ear off about the right way to winterize your lines. A whole community built around passing down the practical, hands-on knowledge that makes this lifestyle actually work day to day. That knowledge didn't come from a manual. It came from somebody standing next to you, showing you how it's done, answering your dumb questions without making you feel dumb for asking them. That community, that natural chain of folks teaching folks, has thinned out a whole lot over the years, and especially over the last several years as this hobby exploded with brand new buyers who didn't grow up around anybody who'd ever done this before. A dealer's not going to sit with you for 3 hours teaching you how your gray tank actually works. They've got the next customer waiting, and frankly, teaching you that stuff in depth isn't really their job the way it used to be when RV culture was smaller and more tight-knit. Back when a dealership might sell a handful of units a month, instead of racing to move dozens off the lot as fast as the paperwork could be processed. So folks drive off the lot with a rig full of systems they don't understand. And the first time something doesn't work exactly right, and something always doesn't work exactly right at some point, they don't have anybody to call who can walk them through it calm and easy. They panic, or they get frustrated, or they just feel plain overwhelmed, and a hobby that was supposed to feel like freedom starts feeling like one more thing in their life demanding more than they bargained for. One more source of stress layered on top of everything else they were hoping to escape by getting out on the road in the first place. I want to tell you about a couple I met a few years back at a state park out in the Midwest, name of Frank and Linda, who'd bought a rig about 8 months before I ran into them. Real nice, warm people, retired, excited about the idea of finally traveling the way they'd always talked about doing once the grandkids got a little older. Always dreaming about it over the years at holiday dinners and never quite getting around to it until Frank's retirement finally gave them the window. They told me they'd done all their homework on the financial side, saved up a real down payment, financed responsibly, Nothing like what we've talked about on this channel, with folks getting in over their heads on a loan. Financially, they were in good shape. And the rig itself was solid too. No major defects, nothing falling apart on them. A well-reviewed model from a manufacturer with a decent reputation. But Linda told me, sitting there at their picnic table with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, that she was exhausted, not physically, but the kind of tired that comes from constantly feeling like you're one step behind on understanding your own equipment. Every trip, something came up that neither of them fully understood how to handle. One weekend it was the awning not retracting smooth, and they spent half a day worried they'd broken something expensive before a neighboring camper walked over and showed them it just needed a little lubrication on the tracks. A 5-minute fix that had cost them half a day of anxiety, and a ruined afternoon they'd planned on spending at the pool instead. Another trip it was the water heater not lighting, and they ended up cutting a trip short because they didn't know if it was something dangerous or something simple, and neither of them felt confident enough to figure it out on their own out in the middle of nowhere, so they packed up 2 days early and drove home rather than risk it, missing out on a lake they'd been looking forward to visiting for months. Frank told me plainly it wasn't any one single thing that was wearing them down. It was the constant low hum of uncertainty, never quite trusting that they understood their own rig well enough to relax and actually enjoy where they were. He said he found himself, even on the good trips where nothing went wrong, spending half his mental energy just waiting for the next thing to break, unable to fully settle into the vacation he was supposedly on. Linda added that she'd started dreading the drive home from every trip, not because she didn't enjoy the destination, but because packing up always meant one more round of double and triple checking things neither of them fully trusted themselves to have done right the first time. That's no way to enjoy a hobby that's supposed to bring you peace, and both of them knew it. Even as they kept trying to push through it for another few months, hoping it would eventually start feeling easier. They ended up selling that rig about 4 months after I met them. Not because of money. Not because anything was fundamentally broken. They sold it because the whole experience had started to feel like a source of stress instead of the peaceful retirement hobby they'd pictured. And neither one of them had ever built up the confidence or the know-how to close that gap between the fantasy they'd bought into and the reality they were actually living. Frank told me, almost sheepishly, that he felt a little embarrassed about it, like he'd failed at something that was supposed to be simple and fun, and I made sure to tell him plainly that there was nothing to be embarrassed about at all. That the failure wasn't his. It was a system that sold him a dream without ever handing him the instruction manual that actually mattered. I think about Frank and Linda a lot, honestly, because their story doesn't make headlines the way a repossession or a lawsuit over a defective rig might. Nobody writes an article about a couple who quietly sold their RV because they never quite got comfortable with it. But I'd bet you a good sum of money that story plays out more often than either of those flashier ones. Quietly. In driveways and at campgrounds all across this country, without anybody keeping score of it, without anybody writing it up as a headline or a statistic, just a couple of good people who wanted something wonderful and walked away from it feeling like they'd somehow come up short, when really the whole system had come up short on them. This is exactly why I do what I do on this channel, if I'm being honest with you. Every fix, every trick, every piece of old-school knowledge I share isn't just about saving you a service call or a couple $100s, though I hope it does that too. It's about closing that gap Frank and Linda never got to close. It's really about you understanding your own rig well enough that when something doesn't work right, your first reaction is curiosity instead of panic, confidence instead of dread. That real confidence is the actual thing standing between a family that keeps RVing for 20 years and a family that sells after 8 months feeling defeated by a hobby that was supposed to bring them joy. I think back to how folks used to learn this stuff, and I try to recreate a little piece of that here every time I sit down to make one of these videos. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't delivered all at once in a rushed afternoon before you drove off a lot somewhere. It came in pieces, over years, from people who genuinely wanted to see you succeed at this because they remembered somebody doing the same for them once. That's the spirit I try to bring to every single video on this channel, whether I'm walking you through a $5 fix or, like today, Just trying to put words to something I think a lot of you have felt, but maybe never heard anybody say out loud before. So if you're newer to this, or if you're thinking about buying your first rig, I want to give you some real practical advice. The kind that would have saved Frank and Linda a whole lot of stress if somebody had handed it to them before they ever signed that paperwork. First, before you ever take a long trip, take a handful of short ones close to home. A weekend at a campground 20 minutes away teaches you more about your systems than any manual ever will. And if something goes wrong, you're close enough to get help or just go home and regroup without the whole trip being ruined. Think of those first few short trips as practice runs rather than real vacations. And give yourself permission to not enjoy them fully yet. Because their whole purpose is building the muscle memory and the troubleshooting instincts you're going to need before you ever venture somewhere truly remote, far from cell service, and far from any help, if something does go sideways on you. Second, learn your basic systems before you need to, not after. Spend an afternoon at home, rig parked in your driveway, running through every system on purpose. Fill and drain your water tanks. Light your water heater and your stove. Extend and retract your awning and any slides a few times, just to understand how they're supposed to feel and sound when everything's working right. Check your fuse panel and figure out which fuse controls which system, so if something ever does go dark on you, you're not starting from zero trying to figure out where to even begin looking in a moment when you're already stressed and just want the problem solved. That way, when something does feel or sound different down the road, you'll actually recognize it instead of being caught completely off guard, and that recognition alone takes a huge amount of the panic out of the moment. Third, and I really believe in this one, find yourself some community. Whether that's a local RV club, an online forum for your specific brand or model, or just striking up conversations with your camping neighbors the way Frank and Linda's neighbor did with that awning. Having somebody you can ask a question to without feeling foolish makes an enormous difference. Most experienced RVers, myself included, genuinely love helping somebody new figure something out. We remember what it felt like being the confused one at the campsite, and there's a real sense of paying it forward that runs through this whole community when it's working the way it's supposed to. Don't be shy about walking over and asking a question. And don't assume everybody around you already has it figured out either. Because I promise you, most of us were exactly where you are once. And plenty of us are still learning new things every single season, no matter how many years we've had a rig parked in our driveway or how many miles we've put behind us on the road. And fourth, give yourself grace. This lifestyle really does have a learning curve, and every single person who's ever felt confident and capable behind the wheel of an RV started out just as unsure as you might be feeling right now. The folks who stick with this hobby for the long haul aren't the ones who never ran into a problem. They're the ones who ran into problems and stuck around long enough to figure them out. One system, one trip, one small victory at a time, until what used to feel intimidating started to feel like second nature. There's no timeline you're supposed to be hitting either. Some folks feel confident after a season, others take 2 or 3 years to really settle in. And there's nothing wrong with being on the slower end of that curve as long as you're still moving forward, instead of quietly giving up somewhere along the way. I truly want to hear from you on this one. Drop a comment down below and tell me about the moment you finally felt like you actually understood your rig. That point where the fear started turning into confidence. Maybe it was the first time you fixed something yourself instead of calling for help. Maybe it was the first trip where nothing went wrong, and you realized you'd actually started to relax. Whatever that moment was for you, I want to hear it. Because those stories are exactly the kind of encouragement somebody newer needs to read right now, more than they need another list of things that might go wrong. And if you're newer to this, and still in that uncertain stage right now, tell me what's got you the most nervous. Because I promise you there's a whole comment section full of folks, myself included, who'd be glad to help walk you through it rather than watching you quietly give up and sell like so many folks do, without ever asking for that help first. I also want to say directly to anybody watching this who's in the same spot Frank and Linda were in, feeling that low hum of uncertainty every time you head out, feeling like maybe you're just not cut out for this the way other folks seem to be. You are cut out for this. Every single person who looks confident at the campground today started out exactly where you are. The only real difference between somebody who sticks with this hobby and somebody who quietly sells after 8 months isn't natural talent or some special knack for mechanical things. It's whether they had access to the knowledge and the encouragement to close that gap before the frustration won out. I'd rather you find that knowledge here, in the comments, from a neighbor at your next campground, from anywhere at all, than watch you become one more for sale sign fading in a driveway window. Before I let you go, if you know somebody who just bought their first rig, or somebody who's been struggling and quietly thinking about selling because they feel overwhelmed, rather than because anything's actually wrong, send them this video. Sometimes all it takes to keep somebody in this lifestyle they were so excited about 8 months or a year ago is one person telling them plainly that the confusion they're feeling is normal, that it gets better, and that there's a whole community of us out here ready to help them close that gap instead of quietly disappearing back into a regular life they never actually wanted to go back to in the first place. That rig sitting unused in a driveway doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes it just means somebody needed a little more help than they ever got, and it's not too late to give it to them. I'm Hank Dawson. Thank you very kindly for listening to Roadside Wisdom, and I'll see you in the next one.